Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Gentry, and I'm an academic clinical fellow in public health at UEA in Norwich in the UK. And I'm going to share some of the results of an online survey of vapers' reported patterns of using vaping to support them to remain abstinent from smoking in the short to long term. So focusing on the results of a one-year follow-up survey. This is part of the wider electronic cigarette trajectory study known as ETC, which my colleague Emma Ward was presenting some results from earlier, and I'll describe how the bits that I'm presenting now fit in with the wider study in a moment. So firstly, I just want to acknowledge my colleagues, in particular Dr. Caitlin Notley, who is the principal investigator on this study, and say that we have no conflicts of interest to declare. The parent study was funded by Cancer Research UK. So in terms of the background, as many here will know, e-cigarettes are now the most popular aid to quitting smoking in the UK. However, although many smokers do manage to quit smoking tobacco, most individual attempts result in relapse. And none of the traditional options that we have available can meet all of the needs of smokers. So NRT might meet, for example, the physical or psychological needs, but they can't also meet the social, cultural and identity aspects of smoking. And much of the smoking relapse prevention evidence that is available is from before e-cigarettes became widely popular, and so is perhaps out of date now. So might e-cigarettes play a role in relapse prevention? So the ETC study was developed to look at that in more depth. So my colleagues developed this. They began by doing in-depth participant interviews to look at e-cigarette trajectories over time in the context of smoking cessation or relapse. They also did some photo elicitation to look at patterns of use where people vape, and some vape shop observations. And some of their key findings, which have been published before from this study, are that vaping did seem to be able to meet the long-term needs of ex-smokers for all of the dimensions of addictive behaviour mentioned. It can be incorporated easily into daily routines, as many people here will know, either as a substitute for smoking or little and often, if someone has a craving. It's pleasurable, so it's nice to use in the long term, and quite a lot of people quit almost by accident. They tried it and then found that they preferred it and gradually switched over. They also found evidence of permissive lapses, so people might relapse to tobacco smoking, but then go back to vaping, so it wasn't always a bad thing to and allowed a no-pressure quit strategy. However, there are so many devices available, as everybody here knows. So starting from the early generation Ciga-like devices, pictured over on the end, through to slightly more modern ones, such as the vape pens, and then even more modern tank devices. There's also the pipes, cigars, pod devices, which aren't included in this diagram, so there's a huge variety of options. And there are also many different ways people use them, different nicotine strengths, different flavours, different locations in which they use them. And so we wanted to explore further how those patterns might influence whether or not somebody relapses to smoking or not. And so one way we did this was through the ETC survey. So the qualitative study that's been described recruited really well, and additional participants were directed to an online survey. So it was a convenient sample. We collected qualitative and quantitative data, and I'm going to focus on some of the quantitative data. And topics covered included device types, e-liquid, nicotine strengths, flavours, and relapse after the initial device choice. So we conducted an initial survey in 2018, and people were asked about their vaping use then and what their vaping use had been like since they started vaping. And we then followed them up 1 year later, and that survey was completed a couple of months ago. So we included about 370 people in the first survey. People completed slightly different versions, but they collected the same data. And 147 of those were retained at the 1 year follow-up point. In terms of the demographics, it is a very distinct sample, so about 75% of the sample are male. The mean age was 50. Most of the participants were white, perhaps reflecting the fact that the study began in Norfolk, but we did have participants from across the country and some internationally. and the vast majority were vaping and abstinent from tobacco smoking and intending to continue vaping. The demographics were similar at both time points, so even though we had some dropouts from the survey, it was a very similar sample at both times. So we tested some hypotheses. At time 1, we thought that those who initiated vaping with an earlier generation device might be more likely to relapse to smoking, that those who started on a low nicotine strength after controlling for their previous cigarettes per day might be more likely to relapse, and that there might be a relationship between device type and nicotine strength. And so our results at time 1 suggested that most participants reported that they started out using some kind of vape pen or cig-alike, but then by the end they were all using modern tank devices. And those who started with a tank or a vape pen were less likely to relapse than those who started using a cig-alike. We also found an inverse association between the starting nicotine strength and relapse interacting with the device type, suggesting that relapse risk was greater if somebody started on a low nicotine strength and or a more old-fashioned device. People also reported that they moved from higher strength nicotine earlier generation tobacco flavoured devices to lower strength later generation sweet and food flavours, so moving from something that's like a replica to tobacco to something that's completely different over time. We then followed them up a year later, and at that time we hypothesized that more people will be using modern tank devices, e-liquid concentration will have reduced further, and non-tobacco flavors might be higher. And so some of the preliminary data on that is that, as we thought might happen, more people are using modern tank devices at the current time than they were at the previous time points, almost everybody now. Interestingly, nobody reported using a pod device. They did have the option to select other and then write that in free text, and no one did that. And that might reflect the timing of the survey, that all of these people would have started vaping a few years ago, and so none have moved on to pod devices. It'd be interesting to explore that in more detail. We found that e-liquid nicotine concentration, this was self-reported, had reduced a lot from when people initiated vaping to when the survey was initially done, but hadn't reduced much further at 1 year follow-up, so people seemed to start high, reduce down, perhaps because their device had also changed, and then kind of stabilised there where they were comfortable. And in terms of e-liquid flavours, we had increases in numbers of people using fruit, sweet or food flavours at each time point, and generally a reduction in people using tobacco flavours. And there's some interesting things to be explored further in terms of that various category, that sort of dark green colour in the graph. So some of those people reported using mixtures of fruit and menthol, others fruit and tobacco, so might be able to separate that out and explore more the reduction in popularity of tobacco type flavours over time. So there are some limitations of this study. It was obviously a cross-sectional survey. People might have recall bias, particularly asking people to remember what their nicotine strength was when they started. It's a convenience sample with a limited sample size, and we did have some attrition at the follow-up survey, but I think we can still draw some conclusions from this. So it seemed that those initiating vaping with a less sophisticated device and a lower nicotine strength e-liquid might be at high risk of relapse to tobacco smoking. People's patterns changed over time, moving away from cig-alikes and high strengths to something different. And based on this, it may be possible to make recommendations for people who want to use vaping to avoid relapse to smoking. And as my colleague Emma mentioned, there's the leaflets that's been produced based on previous data from the wider etc. study, and copies are available from us if anyone would like to see one. Thank you very much.